We're back with the Bloody Alphabet 3, and today we're doing S for Swanenburg. And before we get into this, I just want to remind you all, since the clock app is going way downhill, you can find me with the same username anywhere else you can see videos. And actually on pretty much any other social media. This is a little bit of an experiment to see if I should start doing these videos again, because each one does take hours upon hours, and the powers that be have been hiding them from people for quite a long time. So we'll see what happens with this one. Without further ado, today we're talking about Maria Katharina van der Linden Swanenburg. She was born on September 9th of 1839 and lived until April 19th of 1915. Maria was a Dutch serial killer who murdered at least 27 people and was suspected of killing more than 90 people. Maria was born Maria Swanenburg and was the daughter of Clemens Swanenburg and Joanna Dingen. Apparently, as an adult, Maria was pregnant twice by someone else. I'm not sure if she was married to the person or not. There's not a very good record of it. But she had two daughters, and they both died at a young age, and after this, she married Johannes van der Linden on May 13th, 1868. Their marriage produced 5 sons and 2 daughters, and the marriage lasted until January 29th, 1886. Maria was well liked in her community, and her nickname was Goeie May, which translated to Good May, and was bestowed because of her amiable, neighborly assistance with babysitting and taking care of the poor, sick, and elderly in Leyden, where she lived. Maria's first 2 victims were her parents. In 1880, she poisoned her mother Joanna and killed her, and not long thereafter, she poisoned her father Clemens. It was later established with certainty that Swanenburg poisoned at least 102 people with arsenic between 1880 and 1883. 27 of those victims died, of whom 16 were her blood relatives. The subsequent investigation included more than 90 suspicious deaths, and 45 survivors suffered from sustained chronic health issues after having ingested the poison. Swanenburg's motive was the payout of her victims' life insurance out of their inheritance. She secured most of the insurance policies herself. As a result of this, an article from Vice says that Maria's murders were more about poverty than about anything else. I personally think that's debatable, though. I don't think that most people in poverty kill upwards of 90 people. That same article tells the story as follows. Swanenburg's story began on the 9th of September, 1839 in the city of Leyden. Born into a poor family with many children, some of whom died young of cholera, she ended up living in a small worker's cottage with her 11 family members. Historian Glassbergen explains, you entered through a tiny front room and that was where her parents slept. In the back of the house there was a small kitchen, but they often cooked outside, and the kids slept on the first floor, right underneath the roof. That space was not insulated. When it rained, it got wet. When the wind blew, you felt it inside. Additionally, Maria's father had difficulty holding down a job, so the family was always struggling. When she was 12, they fell behind on rent and lost their home, and they then moved to Singlestraat, a rough neighborhood full of the poorest workers in the city. The neighbors who later testified during the criminal trial said that the girls never really went outside. They'd knit clothes all day long, which would later be sold. However, Glassbergen does comment that this was perfectly normal at that time. Because of her circumstances, Maria probably barely went to school. We know that she couldn't write because she put an X on her marriage certificate, Glassbergen says. When she was 28, Swanenburg married the father of her children, who were born before the couple made it official. Later on, this aspect of her life became fuel for gossip and speculation. It's unclear if the first 2 kids were with him or with someone else. However, soon after the death of her first 2 children, according to Glassbergen's research, Maria did develop a drinking problem, and it was soon after this that she started poisoning people. Criminology today tells us that in order for someone to become a serial killer, they have to have both a biological and an environmental component. Oftentimes, that means that they've always had the biological component or genetic component, and it becomes triggered by some kind of trauma, either early in life or later in life. It seems to me that Glassbergen is trying to argue that the death of her children, the subsequent drinking problem, and the fact that people labeled her promiscuous for having kids outside of wedlock was the trigger that led to her becoming a serial killer, but we'll never know for sure. In the early days of her murders, they were financially motivated, and she'd sometimes managed to be included in someone's will before killing them, but she also murdered people that she was indebted to, and her main way of profiting from the killings was taking out funeral insurance on her victims. At that time, anyone willing to pay the fee could do it, so she would likely use money from the previous murders, put them towards her next murder, and then kill the person and collect the funeral insurance. The method of her murders was one that is very common among female serial killers for reasons unknown, but often female serial killers choose poisoning. She poisoned people with arsenic, which was readily available at the time, and would just put it into people's food and drinks. Unfortunately, arsenic poisoning is very painful, and it's a somewhat slow and definitely agonizing death. It is widely believed by historians that while her killing started with financial motivation, it definitely became some sort of compulsion, considering that she committed so many murders. Serial murderers were also much harder to catch back then because people were so used to everyone dying an earlier death. So it was very common for people to not make it to the age of 30, so with people dropping dead all around, it just wasn't that uncommon. Maria was caught after she poisoned the Frankhuizen family in December of 1883. Her trial began on April 23, 1885, and she was found guilty. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, where she died in